In this video, we're going to talk about how to build a combat robot. When we take a look at a combat robot, we can divide it into 4 individual components. These components are the transmitter, the receiver, the drivetrain, and the weapon. We'll go over each component and talk about why they are necessary to include in our BattleBot. I'll start by talking about the receiver and transmitter together because that's how they'll work in our robot. What it boils down to is that the receiver is the computer that lives on the robot, and the transmitter is the controller that the player will be using to control the robot. The transmitter will send signals depending on inputs given by the user, and the receiver will receive those signals and use them to control various parts of the robot, such as the motors or the weapon. You can make your receiver and transmitter a variety of ways, such as an Arduino, but in our case, we will be using microbits. The wireless communication between the 2 microbits is going to be through radio, but if you're using a different method, you could use something like Bluetooth or Wi-Fi. A couple of things to keep in mind is if you're using something with radio signals, such as a microbit, you will need to make sure that you're on your own channel from other robots. If 2 robots are on the same channel, it could be that your robots are talking to each other, and maybe they're able to control your robot and you're able to control theirs. So it's important to keep that in mind. Also, depending on what you choose to act as your receiver and transmitter in your robot, you may find that you'll need to do a little bit of programming. So if you're not comfortable with programming, it may be better to find a pre-built robot and then take the receiver and transmitter out of that.
Alright, blue corner, are we ready?
However, you'll find that programming your own robot will give you much more control over what that robot does, and something like the microbit can be programmed with a visual language, similar to Scratch. Next up, we have the drivetrain, which is what will allow our robot to move. I think the simplest way to accomplish movement in your robot is with 2 motors and 2 wheels. Now, the motors are going to be connected to your receiver on your robot, but what you'll most likely find is that you can't directly power the motors from your receiver. So in order to give the motors the power that they need in order to operate, we're going to be using a motor driver. And essentially what the motor driver does is it hooks up our motor, our receiver, and an external power source so that the receiver can send a signal to the motor driver, and that motor driver will then be able to either turn on or off the motor. And the last component of our BattleBot is going to be its weapon. And now, depending on what kind of robot you're trying to build, this can look very different. You can have one motor that spins really fast, and then when you bump into another robot, it'll whack it. And then this can be either done in a vertical or a horizontal position. You can also have a weapon using a servo, so you can have something that goes underneath your opponent and then lifts up an arm and tries to flip them over and win that way. Or you can also have something as simple as a ramp attached to the front of your robot. This way you can use your motors, and this won't require any type of additional motor to power that weapon. It'll just be using the power from the motors that are helping your robot move. Now, these are just the bare bone components of what we need to have a functioning robot. You can always add more things, but you'll find that the more things that you add, the more things that you have to worry about. So if your robot takes damage in a fight, it may be more difficult to repair a robot with 7 different components as opposed to a robot with only these 4 components. So that's something to keep in mind. So in the following videos, I'll go over how to implement each of these components, starting with how to establish communication between two microbits.